This is BBC News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. As we go on air, reports from Ukraine that a crowded shopping centre in the city of Kremenchuk has been hit by a Russian missile strike. More than 1,000 people are said to have been inside. President Zelensky says it's impossible to even imagine the number of victims. We'll bring you all the latest detail. G7 leaders pledge to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in its fight against Russia's invasion. President Zelensky asks for more weapons and tells the leaders he wants the war to be over by the end of the year. NATO announces the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. They plan to increase the number of troops on high readiness tenfold. Also in today's programme, 5 days after an earthquake struck Afghanistan, some villages still haven't received any aid. We report from the worst affected districts. Hello and welcome to BBC News, and we start with breaking news. And the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has carried out a missile strike on a crowded shopping centre in the central city of Kremenchuk. He said more than 1,000 people were in the building when the missile struck. Let me show you the first pictures that have come in to the BBC that have been verified. And you can see huge fires there and the smoke as they deal with the immediate aftermath. So let's head live to Kyiv and live to our correspondent Nick Beacon. Nick, tell us more. Nick, I'm going to let you get away and get more detail. I'll be returning to you through the course of our programme. Thanks very much for that immediate snapshot with this news only emerging in the last, 30 minutes or so. Worth just repeating what Nick was saying there, because we saw those pictures of the site. Not very many pictures in so far, but the pictures we put on the screen are the ones the BBC has verified so far. But you saw the huge fires that the authorities dealing with. All of those authorities on the ground reluctant at this stage to say too much about numbers, but certainly President Zelensky saying a little earlier that 1,000 civilians were in that shopping centre at the time of the strike. But the deputy head of the president's office saying what Nick was saying, that 20 wounded, 9 of those wounded are in a serious condition, and at least 2 people have been killed. That is the latest that's coming from the president's office. Let me bring in our World Affairs editor, John Simpson, who's here in the studio with me. And John, I just want to put the map back onto the screen, because I want to start by asking you just a little more about this city, where exactly it is, its proximity to other places we've become familiar with in the fighting. John, stay with me, because I'm going to go straight back to Kyiv. Nick Beak gathering more detail, more information. Nick, let me bring you back in. What more do you have for us? Well, John, I know you're going to stay with me through the course of our programme today as we get more of the updates, more of the pictures and more of the detail on the ground. But thanks very much for now. And of course, as we've already been discussing, the leaders of the G7, well, they have been meeting. They've promised already they will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as they announced they would step up sanctions on Russia. President Zelensky joined the summit remotely a little earlier in the day and told leaders he wanted the war to be over by the end of the year. And in a BBC interview, Boris Johnson said Western democracies had to resist tyranny today, just as they had defeated Nazi Germany in the last century. Meanwhile, ahead of tomorrow's NATO summit, the Secretary-General announced that the alliance would increase the number of forces in high readiness almost tenfold. So let's cross live to Bavaria, because Sean Ley is there for this G7 summit. Sean, over to you. Sean, thanks very much. We're about to take a short break. When we're back, we'll have all the latest on that Russian missile strike on the city of Kremenchuk, a crowded shopping centre. The pictures have been coming in. They're dealing with a huge fire, as you can see. The regional governor saying that this is another Russian war crime. The number of victims, they say, is being clarified. So far, we know 2 people have died, with 20 others being injured, 9 of them seriously. As I say, when we're back, we'll have more on that breaking story. This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. A shopping centre in East Ukraine with more than 1,000 people inside has been hit by Russian missiles. At least 2 people have been confirmed dead and 20 injured, according to the Office of the President. We'll bring you all the latest details. G7 leaders pledge to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in its fight against Russia's invasion. President Zelensky asks for more weapons and tells the leaders he wants the war to be over by the end of the year. Also in today's programme, as the G7 calls for a cap on the price they pay for Russian oil, cash-strapped Sri Lanka has announced it's sending ministers to Moscow to try to secure cheap oil. And Credit Suisse becomes the first domestic bank to be found guilty of a corporate crime by Swiss authorities after a court found the lender failed to prevent the laundering of drug money. Welcome back to BBC News, and let's go back straight away to that major breaking story. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia has carried out a missile strike on a crowded shopping centre in the central city of Kremenchuk. He said more than 1,000 people were inside the building when the missiles struck. Let me take you through the pictures, because these some of the first pictures that came into the building that have been verified by the BBC, and you can see just the size of the fire that the authorities are dealing with. 10,000 square metres, that is the size of that area where the shopping centre is, and the President's office saying 1,000 civilians were there around that building. And as you can see with the numbers outside, the authorities, absolutely their central task is to deal with that fire and to get people out. But certainly the early numbers, with 2 people confirmed dead, around 20 injured, with 9 of those said to be in a serious condition. Those are the pictures of that shopping centre. There are more pictures that have come in the last little while of the authorities dealing with some of those injuries, with people there, and you can see as the camera just moves back to the shopping centre, the flames still going. So the major fires, that is principally what they are dealing with, and all the while they are taking out civilians. So those are the early numbers, but expect those numbers to increase. But let's bring in the BBC's Olga Malchevska, who's here in the studio with me, monitoring the various lines of detail and information coming in and the new pictures. Olga, what is the latest that you have? Olga, I know you're going to stay with me for the next little while, because we are getting more details all of the while, but thanks for taking us through that latest information. President Zelensky's office giving us the early detail on that missile strike. It's worth just taking you through some of the key lines before we move on, because President Zelensky's office saying about 1,000 people had been in that site when the attack happened. It was about 3:50 local time. He gave no details of casualty figures, and you can see the authorities dealing at the scene, but there was that one sentence he was quoted saying it is impossible to even imagine the number of victims. Certainly the deputy's office has been talking about 2 dead and 20 injured, as some of the local emergency teams are working there on the site. But it is a huge site, 10,000 square metres, where this shopping centre is. So and the local authority on the ground describing this as another Russian war crime, and making the point that there were no military targets in the vicinity. That is what local officials are saying. So, as I say, those are some of the latest lines as we watch that major story. Well, we'll have more on that in the next little while, but let's pause for business. And there's been a breaking banking business story with Credit Suisse. What do you have for us?
Yes, that's right. Credit Suisse, the big Swiss giant, has been convicted in a criminal court. And also a former employee too, for failing to prevent money laundering. The Swiss bank was fined just over $2 million by the court, which found that it hadn't done enough to prevent an alleged Bulgarian cocaine trafficking gang from laundering profits through the bank between 2004 and 2008. Let's get more on this with our correspondent Andy Verity, who joins us now. Andy, it's quite a story, this, isn't it? And there's quite a lot of players involved. Can you just explain what's happened today and how we got here? Andy Verity, our correspondent, thank you very much indeed for your time. And now Russia. It's defaulted on its debt for the first time since 1998 after missing a Sunday deadline to make a $100 million interest payment. Russia has the money and is willing to pay, but sanctions made it impossible to get the payments to international creditors. The Russian finance minister branded the situation a farce. Well, I'm joined now by Chris Weafer. He's the former chief strategist for Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, and is currently chief executive of Macro Advisory, a Russian-based consultancy. Chris, thanks for joining us. The finance minister's labelled this a farce. He's got a point, hasn't he, in terms of they've got the money, no one wants to take it off them. Chris Weafer at Macro Advisory, many thanks for your time indeed. I'm sure we'll be speaking again. And delegates at the G7 summit in Bavaria are reportedly discussing plans for a price cap on Russian oil. This is in an effort to target both Russian oil revenues and to minimise the impact of higher oil prices on the world's economy. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka has announced that it's sending ministers to Russia and Qatar today to try and secure cheap oil, a day after the government said it had all but run out of fuel. Last month, it bought a consignment of Siberian crude through an intermediary, but now hopes to talk to President Putin directly. Let's get more on this with our South Asia editor Amroliwala Ethirajan. Amroliwala, thanks for joining us. This is just... Sri Lanka are clearly desperate to get the fuel. They're desperate. The economy is in dire straits. So this is not an unsurprising move, is it really? Amroliwala Ethirajan, our South Asia editor, many thanks indeed. And that's all the business. Thanks. Back to you, Matthew.
Ramzan, thanks very much. Straight back to Ukraine because more pictures coming in to us from that eastern city. And there you see, just as the camera arcs and just gives you more of an idea of the scale, the size of this shopping centre and the size of this fire after President Zelensky says a missile strike by Russian forces in there, the huge billowing smoke clouds as that rescue operation continues on the ground. The local authorities saying that 2 people confirmed to have died, 20 injured, but as you see there from those new pictures, that rescue operation still well underway. So we'll keep an eye on that major story and bring you any more detail as it comes into us. Also coming up on our programme in the next few minutes, the desperate situation with the people in the aftermath of last week's earthquake in Afghanistan. Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Our main headlines here. Russian missiles hit a shopping centre in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk, killing at least 2 people and wounding 20, according to senior Ukrainian officials. G7 leaders pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in its fight against Russia's invasion. They announced they would step up sanctions on Moscow. Now for the next few minutes, let's turn to Afghanistan, where aid has still not reached some of the remote villages affected by last week's earthquake. More than 1,000 people died in that quake in Paktika province, with thousands more injured. Let's get more from Yauda Hakim, who's in Kabul for us. Yauda Hakim in Kabul for us. Now, police in South Africa are investigating the deaths of 22 young people at a nightclub. Local media reports suggest they may have been poisoned, but the health authorities have said post-mortem examinations are now being carried out. The youngest of the victims was only 13. Our correspondent Nomsa Maseko has the latest from the city of East London. Now you're watching BBC News. If you've just joined us, let's return to our breaking news of the last hour or so of that attack, the Russian missile attack on the city of Kremenchuk. These are the pictures from the site, and this is a shopping centre that has been hit, with President Zelensky saying 1,000 people were there at the time. That rescue operation still going on. The BBC's Olga Malchevska is still here with me in the studio. And Olga, for anyone just joining us, just bring us right up to speed in terms of what we actually know. Olga, thanks for taking us through those latest details. A lot of the information coming initially from President Zelensky's office, also his deputy head talking, and he said in one of his quotes, "It is useless to hope for decency and humanity from Russia," as they continue their officials on the ground to condemn this latest attack. We will have more on that major breaking story here on BBC News, here in a moment or two. Don't go away. This is BBC News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. A shopping centre in East Ukraine with more than 1,000 people inside has been hit by Russian missiles. At least 2 people have been confirmed dead and 20 injured, according to the office of the President. We'll bring you all the latest details. G7 leaders pledge to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in its fight against Russia's invasion. President Zelensky asks for more weapons and tells the leaders he wants the war to be over by the end of the year. NATO announces the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. They plan to increase the number of troops on high readiness tenfold. Also in today's programme, 5 days after an earthquake struck Afghanistan, some villages still haven't received any aid. We report from the worst affected areas. And Wimbledon begins in front of full crowds for the first time in 3 years. Novak Djokovic begins his quest for a 4th successive Wimbledon title.
Coming up, I'll bring you the latest from the All England club on the opening day of the championship. So we've had rain and now, thankfully, sunshine with Novak Djokovic, Emma Raducanu and Andy Murray among the big names in action.
Welcome back to BBC News, and let's go straight back to that breaking news of the last hour or so. News that Russia has carried out a missile strike on a shopping centre in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk. At least 2 people have been killed and 20 others injured. President Zelensky said more than 1,000 people have been inside at the time of the attack. Let me show some of the latest pictures that have come in, and these in the immediate aftermath of that strike. 3:50 local time it was, and you see the huge fires that they were dealing with. This is a really large site, 20,000 square metres in terms of the shopping centre itself, and there you see what has been going on for the last hour and a half, which is the search for people and those injured being looked after by the emergency authorities, but the focus has been on that massive fire. In terms of the details of numbers, I read out in terms of confirmed casualties, but with the President saying around 1,000 people were in this shopping centre at the time, clearly those numbers are likely to rise in the next little while. But those just some of the latest pictures. Let's hear more of the latest detail. We heard more a few moments ago from Nick Beak, our correspondent in Kyiv. Well, that was Nick Beak, our correspondent in Kyiv. Do stay with us, because in the next few minutes we'll be speaking to the Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasylenko, who will join us to give us the latest in terms of that breaking story. But news of that attack emerging, of course, as the G7, who was meeting in Germany, the leaders of the G7 have promised they will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as they announced they would step up sanctions on Russia. President Zelensky, well, he joined that summit remotely and told the leaders he wanted the war to be over by the end of the year. Well, let's go back to Sean Lay, who's there at the summit for us. And Sean, has there been any reaction from the leaders where you are to those events on the ground in Ukraine that we see emerging?
Now back to you in the studio.
Sean, thanks very much. Sean Lane, we'll be back to him at that summit a little later. Before we go back to Ukraine, let me just bring you a line of breaking news from Jordan, because 10 people have died and 251 injured after toxic gas leaked from a tank in Jordan's Aqaba port. That according to state television. So those details again coming in the last little while. 10 people have died, 251 injured after a gas leak, a toxic gas leak from a tank in Jordan's Aqaba port. We will return to that when more information comes into us. But let us return to that developing news in Ukraine. The city of Kremenchuk hit by a Russian missile. Let's talk now to the Ukrainian MP Lesia Vasilenko, who joins me live now on the programme. Thank you so much for being here with BBC News. I wonder if you could start by giving me your reaction to this breaking story. Lesia, we will leave it there, but of course those leaders of the G7 countries watching those developments as they emerge. Thanks for joining us here on BBC News. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more on that and more on our headline stories. Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Let's turn to Wimbledon for the next few minutes, because the tennis championships have begun earlier today in front of full crowds for the first time since 2019. Novak Djokovic is targeting his fourth successive title and just won his first round match. The UK's Emma Raducanu is competing in the tournament for the first time since her US Open triumph. So let's head to Wimbledon and head to our sports presenter Chetan Parthak. And Chetan, as I was saying, for Novak Djokovic, well, what was that path like through the first round match? Chetan Parthak there at Wimbledon. Thanks very much. Now, before we end this part of the programme, let's return to Ukraine. That attack we've seen in the last couple of hours on that shopping centre. The British Prime Minister just talking about it at the G7, condemning Vladimir Putin's, quote, cruelty and barbarism following that missile strike on the shopping centre in Kremenchuk. We'll have more on the programme here on BBC News on those breaking developments in Ukraine. Don't go away. This is BBC World News. Our main headlines here. A Russian missile has hit a shopping centre in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk, killing at least 2 people and wounding 20, according to senior Ukrainian officials. The British Prime Minister has just condemned Vladimir Putin's cruelty and barbarism. G7 leaders pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes in its fight against Russia's invasion. They announced they would step up sanctions on Moscow. NATO has announced a huge increase in forces ready to deploy at any moment. The Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the alliance's security and values. One other story: 5 days since an earthquake struck Afghanistan, killing more than 1,000 people. A top UN representative in the country has told the BBC the situation is dire and the world needs to do more to help.
Global business news from the boardroom or grassroots. Aaron Hesselhurst cuts through the jargon to add colour, depth and context. With live reaction from Wall Street and Asia, studio interviews with top CEOs and the latest innovations in technology. Talking Business on BBC World News.
Hello everybody, a very warm welcome to Talking Business Weekly with me, Aaron Hesselhurst. Let's go and take a look at what's on the show. A labour shortage and soaring prices as workers across the world face a squeeze on living standards. Is it the best opportunity in decades to seek a pay rise? With workers across the planet, from the UK, the United States, South Korea and Brazil, are increasingly demanding more from their employers, and this global trade union leader, there she is, will tell me why they deserve to get it. As politicians ring the alarm bells over rising inflation and the dangers of wages racing to keep up, the boss of the world's biggest employment agency, there he is, will tell me how businesses can find the workers they need while still making a profit. Also on the show, the missing worker mystery has hit the airline industry harder than most. So Willie Walsh, the big boss of the International Air Transport Association, known as IATA, joins me to tell me why governments need to do more to stop it having an outsized impact on the global economy. Wherever you're joining me from around the world, once again a big hello and a warm welcome to the show. You know, in every corner of the planet, prices are rising and it's hitting everything from basic foodstuffs to energy bills, rents and cars. There are two big causes of all of this inflation. First of all, there's the disruption caused by the coronavirus pandemic, and secondly, there's the devastating war in Ukraine. Well, that's all for this week's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget, you can keep up to date on all the latest on the global economy on the BBC News website or the smartphone app. You can also follow me on Twitter. Tweet me. I'll tweet you back. You can get me at BBC Aaron. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
This is BBC World News. I'm Matthew Amroliwala. A crowded shopping centre in central Ukraine has been hit by Russian missiles. At least 10 people are dead and 40 injured. President Zelensky says 1,000 people were inside at the time. The regional governor described the attack as a war crime and a crime against humanity. We'll speak to our correspondent in Kyiv for all the latest. The attack came after the Ukrainian president had appealed to world leaders at the G7 summit for missile defence systems to protect more Ukrainian cities. NATO announces the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. They plan to increase the number of troops on high readiness by tenfold. Also on today's programme, 5 days after an earthquake struck Afghanistan, some villages still haven't received any aid. We report from the worst affected districts. Welcome back to BBC News, and let's return to that breaking news that Russia has carried out a missile strike on a shopping centre in the central Ukrainian city of Kremenchuk. At least 10 people have been killed and 40 others have been injured. President Zelensky had said earlier that more than 1,000 people had been inside the building at the time of the attack. Let me show you some of the latest pictures. The scene hours after the missile actually struck. 3:50 local time was when the missile hit, and you saw in the earlier pictures the intensity, the size of that blaze, and you can see the carcass of that shopping centre. It is a huge shopping centre, 10,000 square metres, but you can see the debris, the wreckage all around. As I was saying there in the introduction, the regional governor in the last little while updating the casualty figures, saying 10 people had died and at least 40 others had been injured, but still they work there at the scene, so those numbers, they are only initial numbers. Boris Johnson talking in the last little while, condemning Vladimir Putin's cruelty and barbarism following this attack on that shopping centre. The UN also speaking in the last little while. I'll give you those comments in a moment or two, but these are the pictures of the scene with local officials saying it is a war crime. This was a civilian target, deliberate. President Zelensky early on saying it posed no threat to the Russian army. It had no strategic value. The president saying people only wanted to live a normal life, which is what angers the occupiers so much. Russia continues to hit ordinary people, he said. And these, of course, the pictures from the moments after that missile strike. Let's get more from our correspondent. Joe Inwood has sent this report. Joe Inwood, live there in Kyiv. Thanks very much. I said a moment or two ago when I was giving you the comments from Boris Johnson that the UN had been speaking. Let me just turn to those comments, because the UN saying they are concerned about the intensifying fighting that is going on in Ukraine and, quote, the deplorable attack on a shopping mall. It says it is deplorable, to say the least. Any sort of civilian infrastructure, which includes obviously shopping malls and civilians, should never be targeted. So condemnation added to those G7 leaders by the UN as more of the detail emerges, and we'll have more on that story in the next little while. But of course, I was saying there to Joe, the backdrop to this in part, the leaders of the G7 who are meeting, well, they earlier promised they will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, as they announced they would step up sanctions on Russia. President Zelensky joined that summit remotely and told the leaders he wanted the war to be over by the end of the year. Well, let's go back to Bavaria in Germany. Sean Ley has been there at the G7 summit throughout the course of yesterday and today. And Sean, we were saying in the last little while, Boris Johnson adding his condemnation to those attacks there we've seen in central Ukraine. Sean, thanks so much. And as Sean was saying, so many big decisions at these crucial summits, the G7. Of course, tomorrow we have NATO. So in the next few minutes here on the programme, we'll talk to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's in Madrid for that NATO summit. Well, also to come here on today's Global, the desperate situation with the people in the aftermath of last week's earthquake in Afghanistan. Welcome back to Global here on BBC World News. Now, as I was saying a little earlier, NATO has announced what it calls the biggest overhaul of its collective defence and deterrence since the Cold War. The Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, described Russia as the most significant and direct threat to the alliance's security and values. Well, let's go live now to Madrid and live to our Europe editor, Katya Adler, who's there for that NATO summit. And Katya, that is quite a reset that's been announced by Jens Stoltenberg. All right, Katya Adler there in Madrid, ahead of this summit starting. Thanks very much for now. Thank you. Now let's turn to Afghanistan, where aid has still not reached some of the remote villages affected by last week's earthquake. More than 1,000 people died in that quake in Paktika province, with thousands more injured. My colleague Yalda Hakim is in Kabul and has been talking to the Taliban. Well, that was Yalda talking to a Taliban spokesman. She's also been talking to the women's rights activist Nayela Mirza. Now, before we go, let me remind you of those developments in central Ukraine. The city of Kremenchuk hit by a missile strike today. This, the aftermath, with the governor saying at least 10 people have been killed, 40 others injured. Boris Johnson condemning Vladimir Putin's cruelty and barbarism. The UN in the last half hour talking about their concern about the intensifying fighting and described this attack on this shopping mall as, quote, deplorable. That's it for today's programme. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Well, it's very hot across many parts of Europe at the moment.